Hello everyone, welcome back to D Squared Stories, an audio fiction podcast bringing you short serialized weekly stories. This is the final chapter of the Immortal Love. Every story that I've written so far has had its share of evolving beyond what I expected when I started with the kernel of their ideas. However, I don't think anything I've written so far has felt quite as personal and as wrenching on my emotions as this one. It's for that reason I really hope you enjoy, and I just want to give a fair warning that if I've done a good job on this story, this chapter might be the one to have the tissues nearby for. Without any further ado, let's get into a quick recap and get started. Last time, Ron was held at gunpoint by Benny Russell, a man who accused Amrita of being a dangerous and unsafe drug. Only when pushed to save Heather, Ron revealed that there was a protocol to wipe everything clean of the project, and he activated it in turn for letting her leave. When Benny went to kill Ron, Heather returned and convinced him that what he'd done was enough. Weeks later, the Amrita team continued to try to bring the project back on the wheels as they failed to recover any of the medicine from the human trial. Ron continued spending time with Heather and enjoyed making a wonderful pasta dinner with her. However, at the end of the night, Heather collapsed from her liver condition and asked to be taken to the hospital. Chapter 5. The Hospital. In an even greater driving frenzy than usual, Rohan sped through traffic, getting to the hospital as quickly as he could. Ron sat in the back with Heather, who was still doubled over in pain. He held her hand tightly as she continued to groan. She almost looked to be yellowing a little in her skin. Rohan pulled up and skid to a stop right outside the hospital where there just happened to be some staff with an empty stretcher. Ron popped out of the car and yelled to them. "Hurry, quick! I think she's having liver failure." They jumped over and helped her out of the car and into a stretcher. Ron followed them in, but as they went past the emergency waiting room, someone stopped him. "I'll need you to wait here. Don't worry, we'll take care of her." "I need to be in there with her," Ron said. "You'll be in the way. She's not that far gone that we can't stabilize her." Ron grabbed the nurse by the collar. "I'll stay in here, but so help me God, if she starts to go south, you drag me in there. You are not letting her die all alone. You got that?" "Understood." Ron frantically paced around the room. He cared not for the eyes that were on him, speculating about what Ronald Young was doing in the emergency room with this mystery woman. His expression was grim, and he seemed to tug on his hair with a kind of stress and anxiety he had never felt before in his whole life. He thought about charging through the doors, finding her at all costs. All that kept him from doing it was the fear that he would be thrown out of the hospital and not be able to be there for her if needed. After minutes that felt like hours, finally a doctor came out of the room and asked a clerk at the desk a question. She pointed over to Ron. "Are you Heather's husband?" she asked. "No, he stammered. I guess you could call me a good friend." She nodded. "Heather is still in there. We have her hooked up with a lot to mitigate the pain and nausea. But her liver..." Ron stood in silence as he waited for her to continue. "Well, there's no other way to say this than it's fully failed. And to make matters worse, the contamination has spread to a point that even a transplant wouldn't save her. We can keep her alive for probably a little under an hour. You should go be with her." Ron nodded. He was guided back through the halls of the hospital. He strained his neck around every room, looking to see if he could see her. Eventually, he was led to the last room down the hall, and let in there. Heather was laying in a hospital bed, eyes heavy and shut. She looked scared and in pain. She managed to force her eyes open upon hearing the sound. When she saw Ron, a faint smile appeared on her face. He went down and sat right next to her. "I'll leave you alone. Ring if you need anything," the doctor said. She left the room. Ron gently took Heather's hand as she laid there and squeezed it softly but firmly. Heather gently closed her eyes, still smiling. She coughed a little before speaking. "I always knew it was going to end like this soon," she said. "But I still wish I could have a little more time with you." Ron started to well up. Tears filled his eyes and his hand trembled as she said this. He was, for the first time in his life, struck speechless, with no witty or clever remark to say in response. He racked his brain for an answer, and then suddenly he was struck with something. "Maybe," he said, "maybe it doesn't have to end like this right now." He rustled through his pocket. He pulled out the bottle of Amrita that he consistently kept on himself. He never even disclosed to the team that he still had it on him, because of this exact situation. He showed it to Heather. He pulled a pill out and stuck it out to her. "You can take this," he said. "Maybe a few of them at once can jumpstart your liver and repair your body." Her smile faded a bit, and she went back to looking nervous. She trembled slightly, seeming to be unsure of this offer of his. "Ron, I don't know, she said. So much of me is contaminated now. Even if I stay alive, I might be in no state at all. All it might do is extend the pain I'm in, if it even does that. Ron's hand shook, still holding it out to her. But what if it doesn't? What if there's a chance? Please, won't you just take it already? I want more time with you too. I don't want to lose you, Heather. Her lip quivered as she heard the pain in his voice. She opened her eyes again to look at him. Her bluish-gray eyes, watery with tears, stared at him with a kind of pain she could not put into words. She looked back at his hand. She winced suddenly as a bout of pain flashed through her entire body. She struggled to hide the excruciation of it all. She turned her head to Ron, who now had tears streaming down his face as he desperately looked at her. She took a deep, pained breath. If I say I won't take it, she said, will you stay with me? Would you still love me? Ron froze. He had to fight back sobs as she said this. He slowly withdrew his hand. He put the pill back into the bottle and shoved it back into his pocket. With both his hands, he gently held Heather's. He looked moved with such pity and remorse. He wiped his eyes into each of his shoulders, and he tried his best to smile at her, lips still trembling. Heather, he said. I'm sorry. I was being selfish. I was only thinking about what I wanted. But this isn't about me. He gripped her hand and looked right into her tired eyes. I'm with you. You're not alone. Someone who loves you is going to be right by your side to the very end. Heather kept smiling, but the tears kept coming down her face as she struggled to say anything in response. Please relax, he said. I'm here. Everything's going to be okay. She looked up at him, gripped his hand back. The two stayed there for a while until both of them managed to slow their crying. Heather had one big coughing fit before she managed to calm back down and look up at him. Ron, I wanted to tell you something. Before I go. She started coughing again. You don't have to tell me anything, Heather. But I do, she said. You never asked, but I know you wanted to. Your father wanted us to meet. I know, he said, because he thought I was on the wrong path. She nodded. I could never get him to explain exactly what he meant by that, what he wanted me to do about it. Ron squeezed her hand and shushed her gently. He probably thought I grew up to be an ungrateful, selfish, and arrogant jerk, so he figured you and I could meet so I could see what a real selfless and humble person was like. She squeezed his hand back. Stop that, she said before coughing. I don't like that. He always loved you. He always knew there was goodness inside you. He just wanted someone to show you. He, above all else, wanted someone to see what he saw. And Ron, I do see it. I think he knew I would. I think he sent you to help me, just as much as he wanted me to help you. Ron started to tear up again. He looked at Heather, who just smiled back at him. He heard the beeping of the machine tracking her heart grow fainter and fainter, with less frequency. He trembled as he held her hand tightly. I love you, Ron, she said. You made my last few weeks on Earth so wonderful. You made me so happy, and even at the end of my life, just having you near me makes me as happy as I could ever be. You are capable of such unbelievable good. I think your unbelievable goodness is what's really inevitable. Please, don't let that stop just because I'm gone. Ron was speechless as she kept smiling and slowly closed her eyes. He could feel her grip on his hand fade, as slowly her readings flatlined. She drifted off peacefully, her beautiful smile, the last expression to be on her face, her magnificent eyes, never to be opened again. Ron sat there, crying, holding her hand until he was sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was gone. He made sure until the absolute very end that she was not alone. Over the next few days, Heather's cousins planned her funeral. Ron got into contact with them and insisted on paying for the entire thing. Heather left the house to Darren, knowing that Ron would have never accepted it himself. Things for Ron only got worse in those days. There were mass reports of nearly everyone who had taken Amrita in the test trial having serious side effects. The overactivity of the livers in the otherwise healthy patients pushed their bodies into a precarious state. Those who stopped taking it managed to only have minor symptoms. Those who kept taking it in secret following the recall were on the brink of death. Ron remembered this being the exact thing that Benny Russell warned was going to happen. The team stood at a standstill on what to do next on the project. Ron had destroyed most of a conference room in a fit of rage on hearing the news. No one was particularly surprised by this reaction. However, this was merely a cover for the outlet of rage that Ron had held so deeply inside him since Heather's passing. On the day of the funeral, Ron put on the same tailor-made suit that he wore to his father's, the same one that he wore when he first met Heather. He was unable to push that thought out of his mind as he tied the eldritch knot, the same one he wore that day. In a way, Ron felt like he had been thrust back in time, that all of his progress was completely wiped clean to the day of his father's funeral, and then some. He descended the elevator of his penthouse and was met by Rohan as he entered the car. Rohan was quieter than usual, sensing his boss's lack of desire for their usual banter. About halfway through, he managed to comment. "Terrible weather today, isn't it, sir?" he asked. Ron looked out the window. Having just been in a daze, he noticed how the dreary clouds hung overhead but refused to even rain. So it is. Eventually, Rohan pulled up to the church. Ron prepared to get out, but instead Rohan kept driving and turned into the parking lot. "Where are you going?" Ron asked. "If it's all right with you, sir," he said, "I'd like to go in as well. I think Miss Heather was a wonderful young lady, and, well, I know what she meant to you. I would like to be there for you." Ron's lip quivered as he said this. "Good grief, Rohan. Of course. I really don't deserve your kindness, though." Rohan averted his face from Ron as he parked, and then got out of the car and responded, "I think we both know someone who would disagree with that." Ron stepped out of the car and towards the church. He could see the paparazzi lining the doors of the church. Having spotted Ron at the hospital with a mysterious woman, they had taken an interest in finding out everything about her, down to the location and time of her funeral. Ron seethed with anger. He thought about throwing everything away just to swing his fists at all of them. He got up to the walkway to the church doors, and in the moment he expected them to descend upon him, they ran off to the side of the road. Ron stared as a car, identical to the make and model of his own, pulled up on the sidewalk. He stared in disbelief as he thought he saw himself, wearing his usual hat and sunglasses disguise, exiting the rental car. After a moment of reflection, he realized the key differences. A larger body built from manual labor, the lack of facial hair looking more natural on this imposter. Ron chuckled to himself and kept walking through the doors of the church. "Darren, you sure know how to make an entrance. I guess that's one thing we have in common." Ron watched through the church window as Darren removed the sunglasses and hat after a while, revealing to the reporters that he was not who he had pretended to be. After this, they regathered, not having realized that their actual target slipped through their grasp while they were distracted. Darren met Ron in the lobby of the church. "Rohan, good to see you again," Darren said and turned to Ron. "Hey, big bro, I hope you're doing okay." Darren gave his brother a big hug after saying this. Ron almost wanted to push him away, but managed to resist the urge. Darren was never fully cued into the exact nature of Ron and Heather's relationship, but in the aftermath, he understood it was far more than the investigation into their father's life that it began as. Rohan went into the church to go find some seats for them. Ron sighed. "They got me again, Darren," he said. "What do you mean?" he asked. "God and Dad. They're probably up there laughing at me, how I played right into their hand, how everything I worked for is crumbling around me." Darren pushed Ron. "Again with that nonsense?" he asked. "After everything that's happened, you really think Dad was out to get you?" "All I know is life showed me that there's no avoiding this farce. There's no point in any of this, because someday it all has to end." Darren gritted his teeth and looked ready to yell at Ron. Jessica and the kids walked in shortly before this, though, and he softened and silently took them into the church to find their pews. Ron reluctantly walked in after. He could see the section of the church that had Heather's extended family. In one side, he saw several children with parents. These were obviously Heather's students, some past, some present, all of whom she had affected their lives. They looked to be so sad at the departure of their teacher. Ron thought to himself, with his death, who would be there to truly mourn him? His brother, Jessica, Anna, Jacob, and Rohan? What a pathetic life by comparison, he thought to himself. The Mass started, and the opening hymn was On Eagle's Wings. Ron squeezed the wood of the pew and shook his head. That cursed hymn, that hymn he hated long before any of this happened, made him stand up and start to walk out of the church. "I'm sorry, Heather, but I can't bear this." He stepped out of the church and into the lobby. From the lobby he went to the door. He did not care whether or not Rohan noticed or followed him. He was about to step out to the outside when he felt a tug on his jacket. "Darren, I don't care," he said. He turned to see not his brother, but someone much lower to the ground, a child, one of Heather's students. The wheels turned in Ron's head to try to figure out why he knew this kid, when suddenly it came back to him. This was Bart, the boy from the museum, who had collapsed. The one who had the same condition as Heather, and the one who Ron had given Amrita. This made Ron bite his lip, thinking about the anguish he likely caused this child with his medicine. "Mr. Young," Bart said, "sorry to grab you, but I needed to thank you." "Thank me?" Ron asked. "For the medicine. The doctors, they called it a miracle. The contamination went away permanently after I had all the medicine. I know it wasn't just a miracle, though. It was you. You gave it to us." Ron stared in awe. Could this be true? The primary reason that had been cited for the side effects was the overactivity of the liver. But in livers that were failing, possibly this medicine had some actual application, even if it was not for eternal life. "I know you're sad about Miss Bell," Bart continued. "I'm really sad too. She was really a great teacher in person, but I wanted to tell you something that she told me." "What did she tell you?" Ron asked. "One day, I was crying during lunch, and she brought me into her classroom. I told her I was sad because I was going to die, and that I would be gone forever. She sat me down and pointed to her heart. She told me that I would live on forever in here, in her heart and in the heart of everyone that loves me." Ron and Bart both started to sob as they stood in the lobby of the church. Ron took the boy's hand and gripped it tightly. Bart continued. "We have to keep Miss Bell alive in our hearts, Mr. Young." Ron nodded. "That's right, young man. We have to immortalize her in our memories. Not just any memories, but the memories of people who clearly love and cherish her. We can make sure the world remembers her at her most beautiful, which was the way she made people feel with her kindness." Janice, Bart's mother, came out after realizing her son had run off. She was surprised to find him with Ron. She looked at him, and Ron just nodded to indicate there was nothing she needed to say. The three went back into the church, and Ron sat through the ceremony. One of Heather's younger cousins delivered the eulogy, and spoke at length about how she was a favorite to many of them, for how kindly she treated them despite their age differences. When the mass ended, and the procession was going out, Ron turned to Darren, and nodded as Ron went to go out the side door. He made a show of drawing all the reporters over and out of the way, so that the family did not have to see them in the path of the way out. Rohan and Darren stood behind Ron, as he was swarmed by the paparazzi. "Mr. Young, what do you have to say about the congressional investigation into your Amrita project? Does this have anything to do with why it was shut down?" "Amrita was shut down when it was brought to my attention there were some potential side effects. At first, I was hesitant to shut it down, but I was heavily persuaded, and I'm glad I was. As for the congressional investigation, I don't know what they have to investigate. All the people on those panels were requesting pre-orders of the pills last time I checked." Ron smirked towards the end as he alternated between being genuine and snarky. Another reporter asked a question. "What do you have to say to investors who are reeling from the news of your botched product?" Ron frowned. "Well, I feel for the people who had their retirement funds hit by that, but as for the hedge funds and millionaire donors, maybe they should have put more time into making sure kids could make it to 18, rather than trying to make it so they could live forever. I can say that's going to be my new direction after this. I even have a great idea for a product. You know, there's a lot of people in this city affected by a contamination a few years back." The fervor of the crowd hardly seemed to dissipate from that, and they just continued shouting questions over another. Ron shook his head and got ready to walk away when he heard one more. "Not knowing your relationship with this woman, but knowing that your father was driven to alcoholism and mental illness from the death of your mother, how will you ensure investors that you don't follow the same path?" Ron's head whipped around. He stood fuming in the direction of the person who asked that. Darren looked ready to get physical with the reporter. "What a wicked thing to say," Ron said. "Do you have any idea what it's like to lose the person you love most in life? To see someone who's just a symbol of radiance and kindness like my mother, and watch her die? To have to hold her hand until the last moment and try to be strong through it all so she can pass on in peace?" Ron paused to punctuate this. "You don't get to cast stones. You weren't a victim of his grief. It is for my brother and myself alone to decide whether or not we forgive him for his weakness. And it's taken me some time, but I do. I understand how easy it would be now to give in to grief. The difference is, though, I know my father believed in me, even before I did. He knew my greatness was inevitable. He did a crap job of showing it, but in the end, he found someone to heal the hole in my heart. And from this day forward, I won't be grasping to live 100 lives, I'll be striving to live one good one." Ron walked off as they continued to chatter amongst themselves. Darren and a couple other people coming out from the church shooed them away as Ron and Rohan went to their car. They got in. Rohan started up and smiled back at Ron in the rearview mirror. "That was a splendid speech, sir," he said. "You think so? I felt I rambled and lost the plot," he said. "Doesn't matter. Actions speak louder than words, and I have some actions I need to take." "Like what, sir?" "I'm thinking of selling off my companies and stocks and starting a foundation. We can call it the Heather Bell Foundation. The goal of it would be to develop and get low-cost medicine to children in need." "Sounds lovely, sir. Who will you hire to work there?" "Well, there are a lot of good people at the companies I have right now who would be probably willing to work for a better cause. Some of them probably," Ron said. "Though, I really need someone to keep me honest. I might look up a Mr. Benny Russell, see if he's willing to provide some oversight. I have a feeling this guy would really hold me accountable if it came to it." "I'm not familiar with this man, but it seems worth a shot." "I'm also a bit of a storied figure. Not everyone's going to buy in that I saw 3 ghosts one night and turned my life around. I should probably have a spokesperson, someone who is charming beyond belief, and has a nice, humble rags-to-riches story. Someone who could flatter their way out of a prison if they needed to." "Well, sir, I can't claim to know anyone who fits that bill, but knowing how talented and connected you are, I'm sure you'll make it work." Ron chuckled, not sure if Rohan was oblivious or just wittier than he had ever given him credit for. "Lastly, this isn't really related to the charity thing much, but I'm thinking of taking up painting. There's this scene in my mind of a woman in a museum that I just haven't been able to get out of my head lately. I would like to be able to hone my skills to the point I can do it justice. I would like to make sure that she is remembered, lives forever." "I can't think of anyone more qualified to make that happen, sir." Rohan put the car into drive. Ron looked out into the sky. The clouds had started to clear a bit, just enough for the sky to peek out. He looked up to see the bluish-gray skyline, and felt happy. He brought his hand to his heart. Where he once felt a hole, he now felt filled by a love he had never known before. A love that never flickered, never faded. One that was what he always had desired to be. Immortal. Thank you so much for listening to The Immortal Love. If you enjoyed, please rate the podcast, give it a like on YouTube, or share with someone else who you think might also enjoy. I will be fully honest with you, I have no idea what's going to show up in your feed next week. It might be a trailer for 1 or 2 different ideas I'm toying with. It might be something completely different. I might end up needing a week or 2 off as I try to make sure I'm keeping up with all of life's other commitments while not sacrificing the quality of the stories I try to put out here. Either way, I really hope you'll join us for next time. You can stay up to date with The Immortal Love by following us on social media. That will be D2 Stories on just about any of the major platforms. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to have you listen again next time.